Hello, this is my PostgreSQL server security. My name is Skatchy, and this course is the server system security, and the topic is going to be the PostgreSQL or Linux side security hardening. Excuse me. So to start, the presentation objectives: number one, I'm going to be understanding PostgreSQL and its role on Linux servers, and then two, I'm going to explain installation of configuration steps as a step-by-step on how to install and configure the PostgreSQL, and then three, we're going to demonstrate validation using the nmap scanning. So we're going to basically, once it's installed and configured, we're going to see how we're going to validate it using the nmap scanning, and then four, we're going to discuss three key security hardening techniques for the PostgreSQL. So I'll begin. PostgreSQL technical role. PostgreSQL is an open source relational database management system, basically RDBMS. So it's an open source relational database management system, and it stores, manages, and retrieves structured data using SQL queries. So using the SQL queries, it can be stored, it can manage, and it can retrieve data from it. And then it's commonly used in web applications, enterprise system, and cloud environments. And then it uses the client server model where clients connect to the database services. So this uses a client server model in which a client can connect directly to the database service and inquire about what they want to inquire about. So to the next page. So PostgreSQL architecture. So basically the architecture of the PostgreSQL, it runs as a background service daemon on the Linux system. So it's basically a background service in the Linux system, and then it uses processes to handle multiple client connections. So because PostgreSQL can handle multiple connections from different people, and it also uses processes for that. And then it stores data in tables, schemas, and databases, and then it supports transactions to ensure data consistency and integrity. So it supports transactions to ensure that the data is consistent and it keeps its integrity. We all know integrity is a very, very big importance of today's world. Then default ports and communication. So for the PostgreSQL communicates over the TCP port 5545432 by default. So the default port for the PostgreSQL is the TCP port 5432, and it initially configured to listen only on localhost. So the Postgre is initially configured to listen over localhost, like example, 127.0.0.1. That's a localhost address, and then remote access must be manually enabled for external connections. So in order for external connections to be achieved, um, remote access must be manually enabled. Then it uses authentication method to verify users before access. Basically, the authentication process must verify its user before it has its access to prevent risk, to prevent threats, to prevent vulnerabilities, and on to the next. So installing PostgreSQL on Linux. So to first do it, this is the command you use. You use the first update the system repositories by using the sudo apt update command, and then once that is updated, you have to install the Postgre using the sudo apt install PostgreSQL. So once that is installed, the service will automatically start after the installation. So it's managed using the systemctl command that starts, stop, resets, check the status of the PostgreSQL. So this is basically how to install the Postgre on Linux, the command you're going to use it, you have to update it first. You have to install it, and then once it's done install, it automatically start up, and then you have to manage it. Any command you want to use, you have to use the systemctl. Then configuring Postgre. So number one, how to configure it is you edit the configuration file to allow remote access. So on there, you have to edit the file. You have to edit the configuration file to allow remote access. So if you go back on one of the slides, it said you have to allow remote access. So number two, you have to set listen addresses to the star to listen on all interfaces. You have to put the star excuse me, you have to put the star on all addresses for it to listen on all interfaces. And then you have to ensure that the ports for Postgre is set to the default, which is the port 5432. Then you have to restart the PostgreSQL service for changes to take effect. So when you're done configuring, you have to restart it so you can reboot and it can be up to date so that it can start working as to how you have configured it. So you have to always restart it when you're done configuring. Then the authentication configuration, this defines who can connect and how they authenticate. And then example, host all 0.00/0 MD5 allows all IPs with password. So basically this authenticating the configuration, so basically telling us who can connect and how can they authenticate. And then supports multiple authentication methods. It should be configured carefully to prevent unauthorized access. So this is basically the authentication configuration, telling us who can connect to it and how can they authenticate. For example, you have to allow all IPs with password. You have to support multiple. You have to enforce multiple configure authentication methods. So service validation using Nmap. So Nmap is used to scan and identify open ports and services. That's basically what Nmap is for, to scan and identify all open ports and services. So you use the command nmap -sv-v-p, then the port number, that's 5432, and then you put in the server IP address. So if it's configured correctly, port 5432 will appear as open. So if the configuration method is done correctly, once you use the nmap to see if it's open, you're going to see it as port 5432 open. So this confirms that the PostgreSQL is reachable from another machine. Then next page, so lab demonstration summary. So PostgreSQL installed on Ubuntu Linux server. So you have to make sure it's installed. Then you have to configure to allow external connections. You have to configure it to allow external connections. Then authentication rules updated on the pghba.config. So you have to set the configuration rules. That's by configuring. That's the slide we just got past, how to authenticate configuration, and then service validation successfully using Nmap from Linux. So once you've allowed external connections and you have done the authentication configuration, so the Linux will be the Kali will be able to see it when you use the Nmap to see the ports as open. Then hardening recommendations. Number one, restrict network access. So you have to limit access to trusted IP addresses only. You have to avoid using 0.0000 in production environments. You have to use network segmentation to isolate database services. It reduces exposure to unauthorized users and attacks. So this is basically just restrict network access, and then this is explaining why you need to restrict network access and how you can do it and what to do and what not to do. Then next page. So my second hardening recommendation is strong authentication. You have to use strong, complex passwords for all database users. You have to prefer the sham SHA-256 over MD5 for better security. You have to disable trust authentication method, and you have to implement role-based access control. So for strong authentication, this is telling us that we have to use very strong, complex password for all database users. You have to disable trust authentication method, and you have to implement the role-based access control. And then number three, hardening recommendation, login and monitoring. So you have to enable logging of connections and failed login attempts. You have to monitor logs regularly for suspicious activity. You have to integrate logs with the CM or monitoring tools, and it helps detect brute force attacks and unauthorized access. So basically, it's logging and monitoring. So you have to enable logging of connections and failed login attempts. So this has to be monitored, and this has to be seen. So you have to monitor logs regularly for suspicious attacks, and it helps detect brute force attacks on unauthorized access. So this is just basically um just monitoring the system. Then next, so these my additional security best practices. I'll say keep PostgreSQL updated with latest security patches. As we know, everything it requires is update. You have to keep updating. You have to keep you updated so that you can be familiar with new vulnerabilities, new threat, new risk. So it will know what to do, and then you can remove or disable unused accounts and services. Taking away, eliminating unused accounts is also a good practice, and then encrypt connections using SSL/TSL. That's the encryption method, and then regularly audit database access and permission. So conclusion: so Postgre is a powerful and widely used database system. Proper configuration is required for access for secure remote access. Security hardening is critical to protect sensitive data, and then Nmap scanning confirms security deployment and accessibility. Then these are my references. Thank you.